My usual practice is to kind of sit down with a passage and read it through, just think about it, perhaps jot down a few notes, and then turn perhaps to, then you pick up one commentary first of all and just kind of a glitz read through. I picked up one commentary and read a couple of lines, and I came across these words. The problem with us Western readers about such a passage like this is that we skim the surface of the text with a yawn. That hit me because I started reading the passage and I thought, gosh, where are we going to go with this evening? It's so unfamiliar to us. It's not just a different time, is it? 4,000 years ago. It's not just a different cultural setting. The very sociability that we're reading of this passage is just so unusual to us. So as we come to this passage this evening, I'm hoping as we kind of pedestrianly make our way through it, we'll see that as so often with God's wonderful word, as you kind of take time and you dig a little and you kind of evaluate prayerfully a little, there are some wonderful things that come out. Now, we've entitled this series on Abraham, The Long Journey Home. And it certainly was a long journey that Abraham went on. We were talking the other day, the church officers, and Phil was telling us, I think I got this right, Phil, it took him 4 hours to get from here to Cardiff. Newport, even worse. 4 hours, that's a long journey. And sometimes journeys, can't they? They can kind of... They can take a long time for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes they can be a long journey for good reasons, sometimes not. And as we come back to this passage and we think about Abraham and his journey, we come to a very fascinating point to begin with. We come to a point that should be incredibly encouraging to you and I as Christians who are also on, by the grace of God, this long journey home. And you almost as you read the text, because you read it like we do sometimes with a yawn and quickly, you miss the first point. And the first point is this. Look at the opening words found in chapter 13. We say this, so Abraham went up from Egypt. Now that is a physical description. Abraham left the land of Egypt and travelled north back into the southern parts of what we would recognize as Israel and into Judah. But the words Abraham went up say so much more. And they remind us first and foremost that actually the life of faith, the long journey home, will include those diversions that we make that need to be corrected. Think about what's being said here. What do we know has happened already in the early years, the early Christian years, the early years of faith, should I say, of this man Abraham? We know that it was a mistake to go into Egypt. And we know that whilst in Egypt, he had a moral aberration. Tell them you're my sister. Not exactly an encouraging way to start, but these couple of words remind you and I something very wonderful and very true about the walk of faith that Abraham was called to and which you and I are called to. That by God's grace, there always is a way up back to where we should be when we've kind of fouled, as it were, in Egypt. It's a truism of life, isn't it, that actually no one ever really learns without making mistakes. And that is a truism of the spiritual Christian life, spiritual life. That we are going to find times in our Christian life, like Abraham is here on this long journey, where times when we find ourselves in cul-de-sacs, times when we find ourselves, if you like, in our Egypts, where we shouldn't really be there, or we've made bad decisions. But here's the thing. You're saved by faith through grace. Not of yourself. It's a gift of God, this gift of faith, so that it might be by grace. And here we start this evening. Here's just an encouragement, a wonderful encouragement that it's as though very early on the father of our faith is being taught and being taught for us by God and saying, look, do you know, there are going to be times when we make mistakes. There are going to be times when we go to places or in terms of our lives where we shouldn't be. But there's always this coming back. There's always this way up. And of course, the great thing that we're going to see, particularly this evening, is that the man who came up from Egypt, having been there, was far wiser and far stronger, and was able to face the circumstances that now he faced with a greater awareness of what it meant to follow this great call of God. So diversions. But notice what happens. They come up, and the text tells us that obviously Abraham comes up, but he comes up obviously with his household, with Sarai and his servants, but he also comes up with Lot, his nephew. And we find secondly that as they come up, the writer is going to tell us, look, there are dangerous developments to be avoided in the life of faith. And almost again, you don't get it quickly as you read the text, but as it unfolds, you begin to see what the issue is. Look how it comes out in verse 2. We're told, aren't we, that Abraham had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and in gold. And then if you look in verse 5, it tells us that Lot too had flocks and herds and tents. Dangerous developments in the life of faith. And when I use that phrase, what I mean by that is that as a Christian, you soon learn quickly, don't you, that as you're living by faith, as you're seeking to follow Jesus, there are things that come on your menu, as it were, on your table, like on all of life, that actually you wish you weren't there. Maybe it's illness. Maybe it's a perplexing problem. Maybe it's a misunderstanding of what it means to be a Christian. Maybe there's errors in our thinking. And they can potentially be difficulties. But there is one potential dangerous development to the life of faith that perhaps is far more pernicious, far more difficult to deal with, far more long-lasting throughout our Christian life than any others. And here it is. Abraham was rich in silver and gold. Now let's not be naive. What the writer is pointing to is the whole issue of the accumulation of materialism. We live in a material world. Our life of faith is lived out in the material world. We cannot ignore that. We've got a long history behind us as a Christian church, haven't we, of a foul misunderstanding of how to deal with the material world in which we live, in what we call monasticism. It didn't work. But actually, we live out our life of faith in a material world. And of course, as we think about that, we need to say a couple of things to get this clear, don't we? That clearly the Bible teaches for the Christian that faith and material wealth or prosperity are not mutually exclusive. Materialism and a life of faith aren't actually an antithesis. In fact, the Bible tells us that it's God who enriches a person's life. Proverbs 10 and verse 22, the blessing of the Lord makes rich, and he adds no sorrow with it. And Abraham, like a number of great men and women of the faith, particularly we find in the Old Testament, were extremely materially wealthy. But of course, faith and material wealth don't always sit easily together. Jesus told a parable about the rich fool. The only man ever to go away from Jesus sad, empty-handed, was a rich young ruler. We've got this incredible picture, haven't we, it's not picture, I beg your pardon, historical account of the most fabulously wealthy man that probably the world has ever known, a man called Solomon, who had incredible experience of God actually appearing to him, and yet the whole kind of mishandling of the material wealth that he possessed caused all manner of issues. And there is an enigma in the life of faith. And the enigma is this, that it's a general kind of statements here. When someone becomes a Christian, because of the life of the Spirit of God within them, their life changes. And the life they live means that because of the way they live their life, generally they have a much more healthier, wealthier life than could be expected. That doesn't mean that God makes everybody filthy rich. No, what it means is that generally God enriches our life materially. And that's a good thing. But here's the enigma. There can be a danger to our spiritual well-being in a mishandling of the material. Here's the Apostle Paul writing to a group of young Christians and to their pastor. And in 1 Timothy 6, he says this, look, remind those, he says, Timothy, who desire to be rich, that they will potentially fall into a number of temptations. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Now, that is not the New Testament. That is not Paul saying, look, you Christians, you have nothing to do with. No, what he's saying is you need to be consciously, as an act of faith, thinking about how you deal with the blessings that God gives you materially. And of course, this chapter is a classic example of that by putting this incredible contrast between a man who deals with it with what I want to call, I'll explain in a moment, 3D vision, and a man who deals with it with 2D vision. There's a classic contrast here between the man whose life we're following, Abraham, and the 3D vision he shows here, and the sad mishandling with a 2D vision of this man called Lot. Now, I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, but we need to lay down a clear issue here. It is entirely wrong to think that Lot, first and foremost, was not a believer. He was. Peter gives this wonderful description of Lot. He says, this man Lot, he was a righteous man. Here is a man who is a believer. Here is a man who, like Abraham, and that's why he's with him, not just because they're related, here is a man who is embracing the promises of God. And that what's clear here as the narrative opens out is that there is a misunderstanding here. One of the most poignant ways that I think this has been put was in a sermon that Charles Spurgeon once preached. And I'm pretty sure it's him that coined it this way. Do you remember the story of David and Saul when David first starts out? And David comes back from killing Goliath, and the crowds are absolutely full and ecstatic because they won a victory. And the ladies come out singing this song: Saul has killed his thousands, but David had killed his tens of thousands. And Spurgeon, being Spurgeon, with that wonderful wit and wisdom that he had, he said this. He said, "Do you know what? Poverty has slain its thousands of Christians, but prosperity has slain hundreds of thousands." He was trying to make this contrast, you see, of the difficulty that sometimes comes to the life of faith because we live in a material world. And it is not because we are to turn our back on the material world, it's because we need to learn how to handle it. Lot is a picture here of a believer who allows materialism to get out of control. Now, how? Why? Well, as I said, we talked about a 2D vision. What's the 2D vision of Lot here? It's simply that as he approaches this issue, and here they are, they're in a situation where they're both kind of prospering well, and I want to come back to this, they have to make a decision about what they're going to do. And Abraham says, "You choose. The land's not big enough for both of us. You go one way, I go the other." So Lot looks around, and he looks one way, and he looks the other way, and he sees where the prosperous place to go is. He looks at the best land, he looks at the best acreage, if you like, and that's where he goes. Now, what's the issue? Why is he two-dimensional? Because he thinks about the here, he thinks about the now, but actually he doesn't think about the hereafter. He doesn't think beyond what he can see and reason with his own logic. The contrast, of course, is with Abraham, who has a 3D vision. And what is Abraham's 3D vision? Well, let's let the Bible speak for itself. If you've got it with me, turn into the New Testament and into the book of Hebrews. To Hebrews chapter 11, a great chapter about the men and women of faith. And there we have a description of Abraham's 3D vision. It says here about Abraham in Hebrews 11 and verse 9, "By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God." You see the 3D vision? There's a blessing that God has given me here. It's this material wealth. There's a call that God has given me. What's my priority? What am I to look out for first? To take Jesus' words, how do I seek first the kingdom of God? And Lot made this error, didn't he? That actually he forgot to take that into account. He put at the forefront of his thinking what's best for me and my material and physical well-being. But Abraham's view was actually, I live by faith because I'm looking to that eternal foundation that God is building for me. It's a general truth, isn't it? That Christians are meant to be, you and I as Christians who live the life of faith, are meant to be those who always seek to conduct our affairs, our finances, our decisions not forgetting who we are and where we are hoping to be. To repeat myself, that does not mean that actually we turn our back on every good gift, material gift that God gives, and become monastic. It does mean that actually we need to, I'll come back to the end, we need to think prayerfully about how we deal with these things. But there comes a bigger issue now. Because what happens? Because of the material wealth that actually they have accumulated, suddenly there becomes a conflict. We're told, aren't we, that because of the size of their flocks, there was strife between Lot's herdsmen and Abraham's herdsmen. The only thing I can think near it is this. Both as a kid and as a teacher, is those hot summer playground days where certainly as a kid growing up, you only have one water tap in the playground. And of course, at the end of playtime, when you had to come in, there was this huge, in the school I was, this huge fight and gaggle to get to the water tap first, because there was only one water tap and there was 60, 80, 100 kids trying to get in, and they were thirsty and they wanted to drink. You get the idea coming out there. Notice what we got here. We got here a distracting disunity that has to be sometimes tackled in the life of faith. What do? Here they are, family, brethren. They've got a problem. The land's not big enough for them. What should have been done, you'd have thought, it's quite easy, isn't it? Abraham should have stood up and said, look, Lot, I'm the oldest, you're the youngest. I'm the leader of the clan, you're the follower. I'm the mature one, you're the immature one. I'm the one who's received the promises, you're just tagging along for the ride. It's pretty obvious what's going to happen. I'm going to choose to go one way and you go the other. That's the obvious answer, wasn't it? Notice the wonderful way Abraham deals with the issue. And there are two great things here that we'll look at. Abraham's wisdom in tackling this disunity amongst them, but above all, Abraham's godly character in dealing with it. Let's look at Abraham's wisdom first of all, okay? Abraham's wisdom was this, wasn't it? That there's almost a throwaway comment in verse 7 when this is given, isn't it? It says there was a quarrel between the herdsmen, and then those last few words of verse 7. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. You can understand that in a couple of ways. First, it's saying, look, this just wasn't a problem for a lack of land for Abraham and Lot. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were also involved. You could say that, and that's a fair comment. But I think there's something deeper there. And the something deeper there is this, that Abraham is realizing that in terms of the witness that there was these men by faith following God, if they should quarrel and fall out, what would the world around them think about them? I came across this in some of my readings earlier on this week. If you never read any of John Newton's letters, John Newton was a great letter writer, full of wisdom. And he's writing to a minister about what happens when Christians kind of have differences on non-essential issues. He says this, how the wolf grins to see when God's people show a contention, and how it weakens the spirit of love and the progress of the gospel when they fall out with one another. And Abraham is wise enough to see here, and it's brought out in verse 8. Look, he says, you and I are brothers. You see what's at stake here, Lot, don't you? This is not just a matter of the material differences and the weight of them and our quarrelling. There's something even bigger here. And the bigger here is that you and I, by faith, claim to be one, as it were, in the God that we follow. We claim to be the children of the God who has called us to follow him. We're brethren. How does the psalmist say in Psalm 139? How sweet and pleasant it is when brethren dwell together in unity. So then Abraham makes an incredibly wise and courageous suggestion, doesn't he? Lot, he says, you go one way and I'll go the other. Let's separate. I don't suppose when they started out on this journey they ever expected to say that to one another. I don't think for 1 minute when these things started to happen in their life's journey that they thought that was going to be the outcome. But at this particular juncture, Abraham, in his wisdom, sees that that is probably the best thing that could actually occur. It's not a lone incident, is it? There's a very potent and powerful parallel in the New Testament. On a matter of indifference, when the Apostle Paul and Barnabas have a difference of opinion over a man called John Mark. And Barnabas wants to take John Mark with him on the secondary missionary journey. And Paul says, well, no, I don't think he proved himself on the first one. Actually, I don't think he should come. And we're told the difference was so kind of strong that they went different ways. Now, there's something here that's worth taking note of. It's not saying, is it, the passage, that actually this is the only way to deal with the issue. It's not saying the only time there are differences amongst believers, then the easiest thing is to separate. No, it's not saying that. But what it is saying is there may well be times when, for the sake of the cause of God, the gospel, for the sake of unity and peace, sometimes to go separate ways may be best. One of the great kind of, two of the commentators, in fact, pick this up. One says this: the problem of incompatibility amongst Christians is sometimes best dealt with by separation. And then the second one says this: sometimes even a church split is advisable so that two factions can then follow their own preferred course. Now, please hold on to this. I'm not trying to say this passage is saying to you, this is what should happen every time, to repeat myself. What I'm saying to you, here is a case in point where at this particular juncture with these particular two men in these particular circumstances, this in the end inevitably was the best way forward. Didn't mean it wasn't painful. It didn't mean that there weren't still struggles. And as we know, don't we? We follow the story. Some of the struggles that Lot had were just absolutely incredible. But it does mean that sometimes it's a course that believers who worship the same God, who have the same faith, sometimes may have to follow. But I like this. I don't know if anybody's got Latin here, because I haven't. I wasn't clever enough in school to do Latin. I was in the kind of, the bottom set. But there's a quote, a Latin quote that mostly translated in English says this: divide so that friendship may remain. And chapter 14, as we look at, God willing, next Sunday, shows us that although they divided, what a friendship still remained. Abraham's wisdom. But none of that would have been possible with this second thing. Not just Abraham's wisdom, but Abraham's godly character. The biggest issue in the life of faith isn't being a Christian in a material world. The biggest issue in the life of faith is, am I growing in Christ-likeness? Am I growing in godliness? Am I growing and showing more of the fruits of the Spirit? And here is a man, Abraham, who is showing an incredible depth of spirituality that needs to be thought about. How does he show it here? Well, look about it. Think about Abraham's generosity. Lot, you choose. And when you choose the best land, the best watering places, the luscious meadows, as it were, I'll go the opposite way, even if that means a struggle. How generous is that? Think about Abraham's courtesy here. I don't know why it's not in our verses, but most other translations, when Abraham speaks in verse 8, it starts this way. He says, please, Lot, choose. What a gentleman. That's Christian godliness. And what about how magnanimous he was? Doesn't his faith shine brightest? Because he actually says to Lot, this isn't about me and you. It's about the sake of who our God is. And because of that, you choose. You choose where to go, and I'll do the exact opposite. Wow. Do you know, I've known churches that can't even agree on the colour of the paint they should paint the churches in. Haven't you? There's a real challenge to us here as followers of Jesus. That there are times in life when our love for Jesus Christ is best shown by such a magnanimous spirit in difficult circumstances to those who are different from us. And there's probably some of you there thinking, I'm having a go. I'm not. I really am not. Because what I'm saying to you is, how many times I've failed to do and behave like that? How many times in my Christian life, as I look back in circumstances, I did the exact opposite of what Abraham did. When I thought about myself, when I thought about my needs, and I thought about my choices, and here's this man who for some 4,000 years ago says to me, do you know what, as a follower of Jesus, there is actually a better way. There is a better way to go forward when things are difficult. Let me put that in a modern context. Illustration, then I'll move on. I know of a pastor and his wife who had a beautiful manse in a part of the country, a big kind of 4 or 5 bedroom manse, and they took on an associate. and his wife. And his associate and his wife had 3 young children. And the only accommodation was in the church in a 2-stroke, half a bedroom flat. And when they called this young associate and he accepted, don't know what this pastor and his wife did after a short while? This is wrong. You've got a young family. We're moving out of the manse. You're going in the manse, and we're going to go in the flat. That's grace. That's grace. But notice, my dear friends, as we close, notice, we've not hardly mentioned, all this is going on, all these decisions, all this discussion, and God is not listening. Look at the response. Lot moves off, and the writer says to, look, this has happened, and don't get this wrong, he says, down the road, Lot's going to face some incredibly painful times. But look at verse 14. Lot goes, and the writer jumps straight back into it. The Lord said to Abraham after Lot had parted. Have you known that experience in your Christian life? When you're in a difficult circumstances and there's perhaps hard decisions to be made and you wrestle with them and finally you feel you make the right decision, you try to be gracious, you try to be... And what does God do? Doesn't he come so often in so many wonderful ways and just assure you, reassure you of his love, of his presence, of his promise? And that's exactly what you see here in the life of Abraham. Look at the way the writer does it. Just look at verse 10. I just love this contrast. Verse 10, when Abraham makes the offer, we're told Lot looked up and saw. So Lot looked up and saw. Now look at the contrast with verse 14. The Lord said to Abraham, lift up your eyes from where you are. Oh, Lot's taken a good look and made a decision with his 2D vision. Abraham, you've not lost out by doing this. You've not lost out by putting Lot first. You've not lost out by holding on to the promise. Look, he says, look now to what I'm going to give to you. And what does God do? He comes and reaffirms his covenant and his promises to Abraham and his seed. It's a wonderful way in which God puts his verdict on Abraham's choice and on his godliness. Look up to the north, south, east and west. The extent of it, Abraham, it's all yours. Abraham, yet you are childless, yet one day your seed, your people will be like the dust of the earth. And then comes this wonderful kind of encouragement, doesn't he? In verse 4, lift up your eyes from where you are. All the land that you see I will give to you. Make your offspring walk in the land. Go and enjoy it. In other words, God's saying, Abraham, I've not left you. In fact, because of the decisions you've made here, because of the choice you've made, I will enrich you so much more. That's how God works, doesn't he? Isn't it sometimes that Christians confess that in the darkest moments of their life, in the most difficult decisions they sometimes have to make, that when they make them by grace through faith, God just comes in such a wonderful way. Why? Because 3D vision sees beyond the material to the God who is their God. Yes? What do we say is the sum and substance of the covenant, the agreement that God has made with us in Jesus Christ? I will be your God and you will be my people. It's God himself, isn't it? And that's what's kind of coming out here. And let me just kind of, as I draw to close, let me just kind of try and sum this up by just, I don't generally do this, but let me just kind of give, I think there's 4 really important little lessons we can take away here, okay? Quickly. First and foremost is, God's provision is always superior to any we may conjure up for ourselves. Any choices we think we need to make for ourselves, and I'm not saying we have to make choices, what I'm saying is God's choices are always superior. Secondly, for the obvious, but forgive me, the glitter of the world is not always what it appears to be. The seemingly fields of fruitfulness that the world seems to offer us and we hold out for and we understandably would like are not always what they appear to be. In many ways, that's the summary New Testament conclusion about Lot's choices in his life. Third, the pursuit of God by faith and in worship is always ultimately the true source of life's satisfaction. It's when we forget that we sometimes find ourselves struggling more. Finally, in the Christian life, Christian humility is about preferring others before ourselves in the way we live and the choices that we make. Let's close by reading some words in the New Testament that put this, I hope, in a nutshell. And it's found in Philippians chapter 2, and the Apostle Paul says this: "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only on your own interests," means you should look on them, "but also on the interests of others." No wonder we call this man, or the scriptures call this man, the father of the faithful. What a wonderful demonstration of that. And my dear brother or sister, this ministry is about encouraging you and I to live in that same way. It's not about saying, hey, you're being naughty, I'm smacking your hand because you're not. No, please don't think that. It's about saying it's possible, to God's glory, for us in our life circumstances by faith, to seek on our long journey home, to seek to follow in the footsteps of this dear man, Abraham.